Hello and welcome to the Crossing the Chasm podcast, where we are seeking reconciliation and reformation through exploring points of intersection and commonality. My name is Michael Cartwright, and today we are starting a new interview segment called Conversations in the Chasm. The goal of these interviews is to learn from others that are in the chasm in hopes that we can glean something that will help us on our journey in crossing the chasm between Christianity and Judaism. On today's episode, I'm interviewing Dr. Jen Rosner. Be sure to stick around to the end, where I will reveal 3 takeaways that can help us cross the chasm between Christianity and Judaism. Jen Rosner is the affiliate professor of systematic theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. She also holds academic posts at Azusa Pacific Seminary, the King's University, and the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute. She is the author of Healing the Schism, Karl Barth, Franz Rosenzweig, and the New Jewish Encounter, and co-author of Israel's Messiah and the People of God, a vision for Messianic Jewish covenant fidelity. Today we will be discussing her new book titled Finding Messiah, a journey into the Jewishness of the gospel. Okay, so on this podcast, we're on a journey to cross the chasm between Christianity and Judaism with the goal of reconciliation and reformation. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and what was your goal in writing the book, Finding Messiah?
Yeah, I mean, that little tagline is sort of like the story of my life. So I was born in a Jewish home to a Jewish family in Northern California. Not much Jewish community to speak of, but a fairly strong sense of Jewish identity in the home. We celebrated Jewish holidays, and I was aware of my Jewishness, even though I didn't have, as I mentioned, Jewish community or Jewish friends even that much. And my dad also was very committed to just instilling on us like a faith in God, which oddly enough was a bit disconnected from Judaism in my upbringing, which just had to do with Judaism being more of a cultural identity. And so then this sort of faith in God. And those two things stood a bit in tension for the first, 2 decades of my life. And interestingly, my best friend growing up was Catholic, but I didn't ever actually hear the gospel or learn who the person of Jesus was until I went to college at a large public state school in California, where God was kind of on the move, and there was something going on there. And to give an example of that, the Campus Crusade chapter at my college, which is now called Cru, went from 30 people to 500 people in a 5-year period, and that's when I was there. And so all of my friends kind of just so happened to be Christians, and college for me became a real searching time of starting to engage the New Testament, starting to learn about the person of Jesus, hanging out with Christians and being really compelled by their love for one another and the sense of community that they had, which is something that I had never had. And so my undergraduate years were a real time of searching. And at the end of my bachelor's program, I became a follower of Jesus. And it was this really significant decision that not only kind of reoriented my faith, but reoriented the entire trajectory of my life. Because at that point, I scrapped my plans to go to law school, which had been, the goal. And I decided to go to divinity school instead. And so I went to Yale Divinity School to pursue my MDiv. And at the time, I really had no model at all for how to be Jewish and follow Jesus. I had never heard of the Messianic Jewish movement. I didn't even know of Jews for Jesus. I just knew nothing about that. All of my friends were Gentile Christians who I loved and felt such a meaningful connection with. But the Jewish part of myself had had sort of nothing to say in that space. And I didn't know what it meant in that space. And so for a number of years, I just tabled it. Honestly, I tabled my Jewish identity and went into the Christian church and lived as a Christian. And I kind of bounced around denominationally. The church that I was very involved with at the end of my college years was a Vineyard church plant that to this day, I mean, Vineyard theology has been very influential for me. I ended up in an Episcopal church during my time at Yale. And so So yeah, I didn't know how to reconcile those two parts of myself. And that wouldn't come until later. So that's kind of the next chapter of the story, which is toward the end of my MDiv program, when through an interesting set of circumstances, the Jewish piece sort of resurfaced, and I found my Jewish identity beginning to clamor for attention. And I realized that in just sort of going into the church world and the Christian world, I had left a really significant piece of myself behind. And so after I finished my MDiv, I came back to California to pursue a PhD at Fuller Seminary. And it was really during my doctoral program that the Jewish piece did come back to sort of kind of into the picture. And my entire doctoral program really became a season of me personally trying to work out what it meant to follow Jesus as a Jew. And that spilled out over into my doctoral work. My dissertation, which is now published as my first book called Healing the Schism, was looking at some of the really remarkable developments in the 20th and 21st century in contemporary Jewish-Christian relations and the way in which the relationship between Judaism and Christianity is being reconceived in our day. And at that point, it was like I was hooked. And so I finished my PhD and started teaching for Fuller Seminary as well as a few other institutions. And this has just kind of been my wheelhouse ever since, is both personally kind of wrestling with that tension between Judaism and Christianity and the way that they're thought of and exist in our day and age, and trying to sort of challenge that mutually exclusive definition between the two traditions in my teaching, in my writing, in my own personal life. So again, these questions are very near and dear to my story and my journey. And all of this comes out in Finding Messiah, which is both, it sort of interweaves my own story, some of which I've just shared, with a core set of theological, historical, biblical questions that I hope will increasingly make its way, not just into these sort of academic, intellectual, seminary type conversations, but into, conversations in churches and Christian circles, more broadly, because I hope that the encouraging trends that we're seeing in Jewish-Christian relations will become a broader phenomenon. And I think that's only going to happen through asking questions that might feel a bit uncomfortable to ask.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like this place that we're in the chasm, is a place of tension, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these questions are very nuanced, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, in your book, you indicated that you were writing to Christians. So a Christian that's listening to this podcast, what would you tell them? Why should they buy your book?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why should they read your book?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the primary audience is Christians. And I think, the subtitle of the book is A Journey into the Jewishness of the Gospel. And what I think is at stake, and the book tries to sort of get at this from a number of different vantage points, is actually the gospel that we preach and that we shape our lives around, I think is sort of misshapen and misunderstood if it has nothing to do with God's covenant with the people of Israel, God's ongoing covenant with the people of Israel. And it's funny, when I think of sort of the gospel as I've heard it preached in Christian settings over the years, that's not generally what it's about. It doesn't really figure prominently in our understanding of who Jesus was and what he came to do. And I think that to the extent that we misunderstand that sort of fundamental piece of Christian life and Christian faith, it plays out in all these different ways. On the darkest end of the spectrum, it has played out in centuries of Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. So, Christians would never think of it this way, but Jews think that like Hitler was a Christian. And there's a reason to think that. Hitler drew directly from the theology of Martin Luther, who in the Christian world, for good reason, is this great hero of the, Protestant faith. But he also had a very dark shadow side, and he is drawing from patristic thinkers that came before him. So it's like when we get that one piece wrong about the significance of God's ongoing covenant with the people of Israel, we tend to get other things wrong along the way. And as I mentioned, that has translated into a very to put it bluntly, a very bloody history between Christians and Jews, which again, a lot of Christians, I mean, we just don't talk about this in church, at least not nearly enough. And so it's a matter of that. I mean, I do think that there's something fundamental about Christians understanding the Jewish people as God's covenant people and understanding Gentile Christians as being grafted in to God's ongoing pre-existing covenant with God. And it affects how we read our Bibles, right? I mean, I think according to some understandings, the Old Testament is very difficult to make sense of. If it doesn't sort of apply in the same way anymore, oftentimes it gets construed as like this long enumeration or elaboration of what didn't work, right? What Jesus came to set us free from. And so then you see that we're kind of misunderstanding the Torah, right? God's instructions to the Jewish people. And so then we get this juxtaposition of like grace and law or freedom and bondage and all of these kind of binary categories that have figured very prominently throughout the history of Christian theology. And again, I think that they are all stemming from a fundamental Christian blind spot with regard to God's covenant with the people of Israel that I argue throughout the book is essential in us truly knowing and following this person of Jesus, this Messiah of Israel, who comes also as a light to the nations, which was, of course, long foretold before. So I think there's a lot at stake actually for Christians in wading into this set of questions. And as you mentioned, it's inviting into our faith some tensions. And that's not always a comfortable space to be. I think Western Christianity in particular has spent a lot of energy trying to eliminate tensions, right? That's what the Christian creeds are about. They're sort of like nailing down these very complex topics. And what I'm inviting people to do is to walk right into the tensions, believing that there's something really fundamental to be found in doing so.
Right. Yeah. It's like Christianity, we have all the answers, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, and that's kind of leads into my next question. In your book, it seems like you don't really offer a lot of concrete answers, but you do ask a lot of questions. So why is it important that we ask questions or ask the right questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an important point for us to touch on. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, I feel like, so often, at least in kind of Western evangelical Christianity, asking questions can be a sign of like weak faith. My mom, who's like this quintessential Jewish mother, and the Jewish people, they wrestle with God. That's what the word Israel means. That's what Jewish faith has always been about. And then you want to talk about post-Holocaust Judaism, like there is just some really there's a lot of darkness and there's a lot of obscurity and there's a lot of mystery. And I think that the Jewish people over the centuries and today are much more comfortable with that than Christianity, which is this creedal kind of Greek influenced, wanting to have it nailed down faith. And so my mom, who is this, very, very deep thinker, wrestles a lot, struggles a lot. My parents are both also followers of Jesus. And so when she first went to like her first women's Bible study, she just has so many questions. And the women in the Bible study didn't know what to do with that. And they kind of couldn't be bothered to be derailed from their curriculum to address all of her questions. And it almost became kind of a negative reflection back on her. Like, oh, you just need to have more faith, as if asking questions is a sign of a lack of faith. Whereas throughout the history of the people of Israel, asking questions is at the heart of faith. And that's a very, very Jewish idea. And it's really through wrestling with these questions, as we see in the history of scripture and Jewish history ever since, it's in the wrestling that we encounter God. It's not a distraction from relationship with God. It's not a diversion from relationship with God. It's in the questions, it's in the tensions. And I think all of us could probably reflect on ways in our own lives in which really difficult seasons or seasons where we were uncertain or unsure oftentimes end up being these really rich seasons looking back, where, the book of Hosea says that God leads us into the wilderness in order to speak kindly to us. And so I do think that there's something fundamental about wrestling and struggling. And there's just a deep honesty in that, that I think can only deepen our faith and increase our our intimacy with God through these kinds of questions. And of course, I'm raising a certain set of questions related to, Christianity and Judaism, but I would almost say any questions can serve in the same way.
Do you think that this idea of having all the answers to the questions and kind of relating that to faith, is that a misunderstanding of faith?
I mean, it's a great question. And I always hesitate to say things that will sort of denigrate another person's expression of faith. But I would say, just speaking personally, in my life, absolutely. And I write about this in the book, that through what has honestly been a very difficult journey of trying to forge a way between these true religious traditions that have largely defined themselves over against one another and in mutual exclusion from one another, trying to live in that chasm, trying to live in that gap has been excruciating at times. I mean, there has been so much exclusion and misunderstanding and marginalization. But for me, that has turned out to be my meeting place with God. And I cannot imagine a richer life than what, myself and my husband and our community are trying to do. And it's been through wrestling and through struggling and through pressing into tensions. I think so much of my relationship with God is sort of built around that journey and that aspect of my faith journey. It's been incredibly formative for me. And so I think it's very possible that other people have had different experiences, but just speaking personally, asking the questions and pressing into the tensions has been just absolutely invaluable in my own journey of faith.
So, in your introduction, you mentioned this idea of the in-between path. You call it the third way, that third way that history has erased. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and tell us what the third way is and how history has erased it?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the third way did not used to be so radical. I would argue that the third way was actually the way of Jesus and the way of his disciples and his early followers who were all Jewish. But once you get, largely what we see playing out in the book of Acts, which is Gentile inclusion, which comes as a shock to the apostles at the time. Like, they can't believe that the Spirit comes on Gentiles just as it came upon Jews. That becomes really this sort of plot line of the book of Acts, is then working out, okay, if the Spirit comes on Gentiles in the same way that the Spirit came on Jews, what do we do with that? And I think the book of Acts, in a way that is maybe not talked about enough, is working out those tensions. And so I think what we see in the New Testament is Jewish followers of Jesus continuing to live as Jews. I think there was never a breach there. There was never an understanding that Jesus somehow drew Jews away from Judaism or from the practice of the Torah and these rich rituals and way of life that have always characterized the Jewish people. I think it's later, once you have Gentile inclusion, and once the church begins to spread very rapidly among the Gentiles, and also, the political situation at the time. So you have the Roman Empire, and you end up having these series of Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire, which create a liability for the Gentile Christian community to increasingly identify, or to sort of identify any longer with the Jewish community. And so you have sort of the early seeds of the parting of the ways, which is this process whereby Judaism and Christianity divorce themselves from one another. And it really is a mutual process. If you read the church fathers, they are so intentional in trying to drive a wedge between Judaism and what is now, Christianity or Gentile Christianity. And you have the rabbis or the sort of leaders of the proto-rabbinic Jewish community doing the same thing, trying to sort of stamp out any kind of middle ground whereby one could follow Jesus as a Jew. And so this is sort of this complex history that takes place over centuries that is now called the parting of the ways, whereby it becomes basically impossible for Jews to follow Jesus as a Jew. And we have these conversion liturgies from the 7th century and other, other time periods where if a Jew wanted to become a follower of Jesus, which had societal benefits for centuries, they had to renounce any shred of Jewish identity or Jewish practice or Jewish community. And so that's the history that we are heirs of, is this history whereby you cannot be a Jew and a Christian simultaneously, which is what I would argue. The nomenclature is very difficult here. But that's what I would argue is exactly what Jesus's followers were doing, and what Jesus sort of modeled to them. So I think it wasn't always such a strange concept, but in our day and age, it's become strange to think of somebody, and part of this is the way in which categories like the law get construed as this thing that's very anti-gospel and anti-grace, and yet that's our misunderstanding. I think that's very far from the world of the New Testament. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned the book of Acts. When it comes to Paul and his letters, a lot of things have been misunderstood about what he's actually talking about. And I feel like the book of Acts is the key. And understand, in order to understand the words of Paul, we need to understand the actions of Paul. Actions speak louder than words. So the book of Acts is a very important book when it comes to understanding Paul.
And if we just look at the canon of the New Testament, I mean, the way that the New Testament was canonized, the book of Acts comes first. It's as though the canon is asking us and instructing us to read Paul's letters through the book of Acts. I think there's something deeply meaningful about that. And yet, at least in contemporary New Testament studies or Pauline studies, that's not often done. But I completely agree with you. Paul only makes sense through the lens of the book of Acts.
Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought of it that way, how the order of the canon helps in the way that we should interpret the New Testament, with the book of Acts being before the epistles. That should inform how we interpret the epistles. That's a good point. In chapter 3 of your book, titled "Lost in Translation," you talk about the ways that words are translated, and how these translations can lend the reader to have a negative view of Judaism and inevitably make Jesus unrecognizable to the Jewish people. Could you elaborate a little bit on that idea?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I think as English, as readers of the English Bible or any language other than Greek and Hebrew, quite frankly, we don't often think about the way in which translations impact meaning. And there's a lot of choices that get made in translating the text. And interestingly, much of our English translations, at the very least, serve to obscure the connection between Jesus and Judaism. So I mention, one. Well, I'll mention two examples. The first is something that we've already mentioned, which is the word Torah. So Torah is this very rich Hebrew word meaning teaching or instruction that has such a rich connotation in Judaism. The Torah is a gift to the Jewish people and has always been understood as such. I mean, if we read the Psalms, the Torah is like sweeter than honey. It's a lamp unto our path. It's this very lofty description of what Torah is. And when the Old Testament gets translated into Greek, the word Torah gets translated as nomos, which is law. And that's sort of carried over ever since, into our English translations as well. And once we think about Torah as law, you sort of just get layer upon layer of negative connotations piled on top of that translation decision. And so, you think about the word legalism. Like, I feel like in most Christian circles, legalism is like a bad word. It's like the last thing that anybody wants to be is legalistic, which is sort of based on this foundation of law. And it's just this language that inevitably pits Christianity against Judaism. And so the Pharisees become these legalistic sort of blind guides of Second Temple Judaism. Whereas if we just strip away the word law and go back to Torah, and if we read our Bibles and what Torah actually is, I think it really changes that portrait. And I think it begins to give us a new understanding of God's covenant with the people of Israel, which has always been based on a concrete set of actions and practices that I think looks a lot like what we would call discipleship in Christian circles. So that's one, is this sort of law legalism word. And another maybe more subtle translation decision that I point out in the book, I look at this passage in Matthew 9, this kind of curious passage in a lot of ways where, the synagogue leader comes to Jesus and says that his daughter's dying. And as Jesus is going there, this woman with a problem of bleeding, which is another interesting translation choice. That's sort of euphemistic language for ritual impurity, which again, there's so much to say about ritual impurity, and there's a chapter on that in the book as well. But she reaches out to touch, and in the English translations, it often says like the hem of Jesus' garment or the edge of his cloak, which sort of paints Jesus as like this cloaked, whatever. But actually, what the Greek word is his tzitzit. It's the fringes on Jesus's garment, which takes us back to Numbers 15, where the Jewish people are commanded to wear these fringes on their garments, which Jews forever and including today have been doing. And so it's the actual Greek term situates Jesus as like a Jewish man who's wearing the fringes like every other Jewish man, since Numbers 15. And yet to translate that as cloak really obscures that really significant marker of who Jesus was. And yet in Matthew 23, when Jesus is censuring the Pharisees, the text says explicitly in most English translations that they were wearing the tassels. And so it's the same Greek word. And yet in most English translations, the impression we get is that those legalistic Pharisees, they're the ones wearing the fringes or the tassels, and Jesus is wearing this like weird cloak thing. And so it's just, again, it's these subtle translation decisions that I think actually paint a picture in our mind that goes right along with this narrative of the parting of the ways, whereby Judaism and Christianity are separate things. And, Jesus came to found this thing called Christianity. I mean, it's a whole narrative. And I think our translations just play into that.
As far as the translations go, do you think this is something that they're doing purposefully, or is it just something that's so ingrained in the worldview they don't even know that they're doing it?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And there are some translations, I think, that are trying to, the Tree of Life version, for example, is really trying to, it's like a Messianic Jewish translation that's trying to bring out some of these connections that have been obscured. And I would say it's a little bit both and. I think maybe that's a harder distinction to make, whether it's intentional or whether it's just in the air that we breathe. I think it's both. And I think that becomes kind of a self-reinforcing cycle, right? The more that we believe these things, the more that we describe things in language that reflects this division, and then the more that causes us to believe in the division. So I think it's complicated, and I do want to say, like, translators are tasked with an immense job and a very difficult one. But these are the things that kind of jump out to me, given the lens that I approach Scripture from. And so I don't know. I mean, it would be a really interesting question to ask, some of these translators, like, why does the translation intentionally obscure that Jesus is wearing fringes, as are the Pharisees? I don't have a great answer to that, but I think it's some combination of intentionality and the air that we breathe, even unaware of doing so, of perpetuating such a mentality. And I think that also applies more broadly to this conversation among Christians. I don't think that Christians who sort of ascribe to a kind of parting of the ways mentality are intentionally trying to be malicious towards Jews. I think it's just the sermons that we hear preached and the way we've been taught to read our Bibles and, the Christian literature that we read. I think it's just so ingrained in our everyday lives that's just how we think about it. And so it becomes a real challenge to try to encourage new patterns of thinking and new paradigms around these questions.
So on a practical level, how can we move people towards caring about the Jewishness of the gospel?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question, right? It's one thing to just sort of talk about ideas. It's another to talk about like the so what of these things. And I think Christians are very concerned with how we understand our Bibles. And so I do feel like that's a major sticking point of saying, in order to understand our Bibles, like we actually sort of need to engage with some of this stuff. We need to know something about Judaism. I mean, this is what I argue in my theology classes. Like, in order to understand Christian theology, we have to know something about Judaism. And I think just sort of one very simple answer to your question is relationship, right? I mean, I think there's lots and lots of Christians out there who maybe have never met a Jewish person, who have zero interaction with the Jewish people. And I think that if we are led to sort of stop in our tracks and reconsider who the Jewish people are and what God's covenant with the people of Israel means. I encourage Christians to like reach out to Jews, like try to get involved with some kind of interfaith dialogue or interfaith engagement, or reach out to a synagogue in your area. Just like engage these people as like the covenant people of God. And, even in the way that we read our Bibles, for example, I already mentioned ritual purity. Like that seems like such an obscure, irrelevant category for Christians. And yet it's a really prominent part of the Judaism of Jesus' day. I think there could be a number of different entry points for Christians to engage. And I think for different Christians, different things will strike. I talk in the book about the Sabbath, right? Which is this largely lost concept and practice in Christianity. And so to sort of re-engage with certain practices or certain rituals, or, I talk in the book about mourning and the way in mourning, like the ways that Jews mourn and grieve. I think there's so many ways in which Christian faith can be enriched by this kind of encounter with Jewish ideas, with Jewish practices, with the Jewish people. And so I think it's going to look different for different Christians. I think there will be different sort of hooks or sticking points where Christians are sort of intrigued by this kind of conversation. And I think all of them are good. I think all of them need to be paths that are increasingly walked along and tread upon. And so I don't know that there's sort of a one size fits all answer to that question, but I hope that there's lots of ways that Christians would be. And I think we're living in an interesting time where I think there is a lot of Christian interest in Jewish things. And so one of the exciting things is that there's a lot of resources out there for Christians to have kind of a new encounter with the God of Israel through, these avenues that we're talking about.
Yeah, and your book will be one of those resources.
I hope so. That's the goal. That's the hope, is that it would be one of those kinds of resources.
Yeah, me and my wife, we read the book together, really enjoyed it. It covered a lot of the topics that need to be covered, and I feel like it's a good introductory book for those that are interested in these topics, and it's definitely going to be a book that I recommend to anybody that's interested in diving into the chasm between Christianity and Judaism.
Thank you. Yeah, the goal was for it to be accessible. The goal is for it not to be this like deep, heady theology book, but just to be these conversations that are very inviting and very accessible for Christians, wherever they find themselves. So I'm glad to hear that, it resonated in that way.
Okay, so we're going to end this interview with the section I like to call the fivefold inquiry. Okay. So number one.
Okay.
What's a hidden talent that nobody knows about?
Of mine?
Of yours.
Oh, a hidden talent. Oh, that's a good one. Let's see. Oh, I'm very good at riddles, especially riddles that have to do with words. My husband has been doing a lot of like riddles with our kids. He has these books of riddles, and I'm so good at them. It's like a hidden talent. So cool. So there's that. My kids are always like, "How did you know that?"
Well, trying to understand the Bible is like trying to understand a riddle. It's like a transferable
I hadn't
skill,
thought
right?
it that way. Maybe there's something theological about that. Good point.
Number two, what's your favorite book in the Bible and why?
Yeah, I would have to say, and this relates to our conversation, I think the book of Acts, because I think that the events and the conversations that are happening in the book of Acts are just so central from my perspective in understanding the entirety of the New Testament and of what it means to be the people of God in Jesus Christ, and what that looks like for Jews and Gentiles to come together as the people of God. I think that Acts is just so rich in ways that are not always tapped into. And as we've mentioned before, I think Acts is so significant in terms of understanding Paul. So that would probably be my answer to that one.
What's the last book that you've read?
The last book that I've read. It's funny. This is not generally the case, but I'm in the middle of 5 books right now. Nice. So I have to think of the last one that I actually finished. I mean, maybe I'll just say one of the ones that I'm reading right now that I would love to sort of highlight. I haven't finished it yet, but maybe by the time this airs or whatever, I will have. It's Tish Harrison Warren's book, Prayer in the Night. She's an Anglican pastor, and she's just an incredible writer. She writes for the New York Times. She's written for Christianity Today. This is her second book, and it's just such a rich invitation into like a full-bodied life of faith. And she's wrestling with kind of this question of theodicy about, how do bad things happen when there's a good and gracious and all-powerful God? And it's just really real and raw. And when we talk about some of the tensions of faith, I really think about her and her writing and the way that it invites us to embrace those. I mean, she's not wrestling with Judaism at all, but her perspective on faith, I would say, is very similar to mine in that it's gritty and it's messy and it's not cut and dry. And there's something really rich and really meaningful about that. So I'll say that one because it's sort of the first one that comes to mind.
Okay. I got two good ones for you. Last two. Okay. You ready?
Okay. I'm ready.
What is the gospel?
That's a good question. As someone who's written a book with gospel in the title or subtitle, I should have a good answer. I would say that the gospel is the story of God's covenant with the people of Israel, expanding outward to include all nations through the person of Jesus Christ. That'll be my succinct gospel. Of course,
Okay.
you could have footnotes after that, but
Right.
that's
Right.
I think that would be my succinct gospel statement.
Okay. Last one. What is legalism?
What is legalism? Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? Because that's such a negative term. And what I want to say is legalism is a loaded term in Christian circles that actually refers to the faithfulness of Israel in following covenant relationship with God. So I want to kind of flip the negative connotations of that term and say that we all should be a little more legalistic. There was this tweet on Twitter that just got everybody all riled up. I think it was Matt Thiessen, who's this incredible New Testament scholar who writes about, ritual purity in the Gospels. And I think it was maybe him who tweeted like Jesus was a legalist. And I love that. Like I love kind of poking at this negative connotation of legalism. So I think we should all be more legalistic in our faith lives.
That's a good answer. It's a very creative way of answering that. It's just a term I've heard a lot of people use, but it's very rare that I've ever heard anybody be able to define it. It seems like anytime you have to do something, it's legalistic.
Yeah. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I think that term has become such a problem in everyday Christian language. Part of the reason is because it gets used so often and in such a negative way. And that's really one of the things that I'm trying to push back against.
Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the interview, and I hope that you gleaned something helpful for your journey. If you did, please share. Now I will reveal 3 takeaways that I believe can aid us in crossing the chasm between Christianity and Judaism. Number 1, ask questions. Never be afraid to ask questions. When we ask questions, we get answers. When we ask questions, they have the ability to take us on unexpected journeys of growth and discovery. Personally, asking questions is what has led me into this chasm between Christianity and Judaism and the mission to reconcile the two. This was an unexpected journey, but I've discovered so many truths that I wouldn't have discovered if I didn't ask those questions. Number 2, be comfortable being uncomfortable. You will find that when you ask questions, they will take you to uncomfortable places of tension. We live in times of polarization, and we are prone as human beings to respond to questions with black and white answers. But if we continue to ask questions, we will learn that a lot of times the answers are in the gray. We will learn to hold ideas in tension to one another and ultimately gain greater clarity and understanding of Jesus, his teachings, and the teachings of the apostles. Now, number 3 is more than a takeaway, but an exhortation. And the exhortation is Be more legalistic. I like how Jen flips the negative connotation of legalism to a positive connotation. She defines legalism as the faithfulness of Israel and following covenant relationship with God. If this is the case, then Jesus certainly was legalistic. Maybe we should view the term in a more positive light, as it describes the life and religious practice of the Lord we follow. He was faithful to the commandments incumbent upon him. So if we are to be true disciples of Jesus, then we must imitate him and be faithful to the commandments incumbent upon us. Combining all of the aforementioned takeaways can bring us a step closer toward crossing the chasm between Christianity and Judaism. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Crossing the Chasm podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing with your family and friends. God bless.